A promise the system couldn't keep. It sounded simple, almost reassuring. A promise that the worst outcomes had been engineered away, that modern finance had learned enough, adapted enough, and built enough safeguards to prevent true collapse from ever returning. To understand why this promise still matters, we have to go back to the moment confidence crossed into certainty. After repeated interventions, reforms, and recoveries, the system began telling itself a story. That volatility could be managed, that failure could be contained, that trust, once restored, would hold indefinitely. This belief didn't emerge from arrogance. It emerged from experience. Each crisis was met with action. Each shock was absorbed. Each recovery arrived faster than the last. Over time, survival became evidence, and evidence became expectation. Institutions internalized the promise quickly, planning horizons shortened. Worst-case scenarios were softened. Models assumed backstops would hold long enough to matter. The idea of total breakdown felt outdated, something belonging to a less sophisticated past. Markets reflected the same confidence. Risk premiums narrowed. Volatility was treated as temporary noise. Investors believed exits would always exist. Liquidity would always return, and intervention would always arrive before damage became irreversible. The reveal began quietly. The promise was never written into law. It was never guaranteed explicitly. It lived in assumptions, in behavior, in the way decisions were made without fully acknowledging what might happen if the promise failed. Because promises that are never tested feel unbreakable. The system did not remove risk. It removed doubt. And when doubt disappears, preparation often follows. The early tension formed here. A system built to withstand stress began assuming stress would remain manageable. Confidence shifted from conditional to absolute. Protection was no longer something to activate. It was something to rely on. And reliance changes behavior in ways no safeguard can fully control. The promise the system couldn't keep was not about avoiding failure forever. It was about believing it wouldn't arrive unexpectedly. And history has a way of challenging beliefs built on certainty. As belief in the promise deepened, behavior across the system shifted in subtle but consequential ways. Preparation gave way to assumption. Safeguards were no longer treated as emergency tools, but as permanent features of the landscape. Always present, always ready, always sufficient. Institutions adjusted their posture accordingly. Buffers were held, but flexibility declined. Risk scenarios narrowed. Planning focused on disruptions that could be managed, not shocks that could surprise. The unimaginable slowly became unnecessary to imagine at all. Markets absorbed the same logic. Pricing reflected confidence that extreme outcomes would be interrupted before they could unfold. Liquidity was assumed to return quickly. Correlations were treated as stable. The system behaved as if time itself would always be available to respond. This was the reveal sharpening. The promise had altered incentives. Caution no longer earned advantage. Speed did. Scale did. Complexity did. If failure was always containable, then pushing boundaries felt rational. The system didn't become reckless. It became comfortable. Early warning signs were present, but they lacked urgency. Stress appeared in unfamiliar places. Dependencies grew quietly. Intervention smoothed disruption so efficiently that pressure rarely surfaced long enough to force correction. Each successful containment reinforced the belief that the promise held. The early conflict formed here. The system was strong, but it was also assuming it would always have time. Time to respond. Time to coordinate. Time to intervene. But time, unlike capital, cannot be stored in advance. The promise the system relied on was never about eliminating risk. It was about controlling timing. And timing is the one variable no system can fully command. The question was no longer whether safeguards worked. It was whether they would work before it was too late. The conflict reached its emotional peak when timing slipped out of reach. Not dramatically, not visibly, but just enough to expose how fragile the promise truly was. A disruption moved faster than expected. Coordination lagged. Signals arrived out of order. And for the first time in years, the system felt briefly unsupervised. Institutions reacted, but not in sync. Some moved early. Others waited for confirmation. Assumptions that once aligned behavior now fractured it. The belief that intervention would arrive in time began to wobble, not because it failed, but because it was momentarily uncertain. This hesitation mattered. In a system built on confidence and timing, even a short delay changes everything. Liquidity paused. Prices adjusted sharply. Risks that had been spread thin began reassembling in visible places. The promise had not broken, but it had been tested. This was the heart of the conflict. Safeguards were designed to respond to stress, but not to surprise. They required recognition, coordination, and execution. When events moved faster than expectation, the system discovered how much it relied on sequence rather than strength. The emotional weight of this moment came from realization. The promise was conditional. It worked only if detection came early, response came quickly, and behavior remained orderly. None of those were guaranteed. The system had mistaken success under managed conditions for invulnerability under all conditions. Internally, recalculation began. Models were questioned. Assumptions were re-examined. The idea that collapse could always be prevented gave way to a more uncomfortable truth. It could only be delayed, redirected, or softened, never erased entirely. The buildup was complete. The promise the system couldn't keep was no longer abstract. It had revealed its edge. And once an edge is visible, behavior must change, because systems built on certainty struggle most when certainty fades. The resolution did not come from collapse, but from recalibration. The system did not fail, but it learned. The momentary slip in timing was enough to shatter the illusion of certainty that had quietly taken hold. The climax arrived in a collective recognition. Safeguards are powerful, but they are not guarantees. Intervention can soften outcomes, but cannot control every variable. Time, coordination, and human reaction will always introduce uncertainty that no framework can fully master. In response, expectations shifted. Institutions stopped treating protection as automatic and began treating it as conditional. Planning expanded beyond what could be managed quickly. Resilience was redefined not as the ability to prevent every failure, but as the ability to absorb surprise without panic. The resolution reshaped behavior across the system. Risk was repriced. Liquidity assumptions were tightened. Dependencies were examined with greater skepticism. The promise was not abandoned, but it was rewritten. Stability would be pursued, not presumed. What endured was a critical lesson. Systems do not break because safeguards fail completely. They break when confidence in those safeguards becomes absolute. Certainty removes urgency. Urgency drives preparation. And preparation is what keeps surprise from turning into collapse. The promise the system couldn't keep was never malicious. It was human. A desire to believe that enough intelligence, enough tools, and enough experience could finally remove uncertainty from the future. But uncertainty is not a flaw in the system. It is a condition it must survive within. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.